John Carter was left homeless and ignored after serving his country, only to face the cruel injustice of being denied care for a dying dog he rescued. The Harper family, wealthy and secretive, fought to take Buddy, and the fortune hidden in his collar, away from him. But John uncovered a hidden will that turned the tables, giving him the power to fight for what was rightfully theirs. Just listen to how this story unfolds and why justice and hope ultimately triumphed in the end. John Carter had once been a decorated soldier. 2 tours in Afghanistan had taught him discipline, courage, and sacrifice. But when he came home, there were no parades, no medals pinned on his chest. Instead, there was silence, the kind of silence that follows a door closing without a word. No one asked how he was doing. No one asked what he had seen. Life had moved on without him, and he had been left behind. The years after his service had been relentless. PTSD haunted his nights. Every siren, every shout, every shadow reminded him of places he could never return to. Job after job slipped away, not because of laziness or lack of effort, but because no one wanted to hire someone who carried invisible scars. Eventually, eviction notices piled up. His savings vanished. His home disappeared. Now, John lived in the cold shadow beneath a bridge in downtown Cleveland, wrapped in tattered blankets, sleeping beside a rusted shopping cart that carried his few belongings. One morning in early December, Cleveland woke to a frost that bit deep into the bones. Steam rose from manholes, curling in the pale dawn light. John stirred under his blanket. Hunger gnawed at his stomach, but more pressing was the bitter wind cutting through his thin coat. He stepped outside, the cold air biting at his face, and began his routine, looking for anything that might pass for a day's fortune. Discarded bottles, a handful of coins, scraps of food. That's when he heard it, a faint whimper coming from the shadows nearby. At first, he thought it might be his imagination, the wind playing tricks. But the sound grew sharper, more desperate. John followed it quietly, each step crunching against the frost-covered ground. Behind an overturned cardboard box near the curb lay a small dog, its fur matted, trembling violently. The animal's eyes were dull, clouded with sickness, and its ribs showed through thin patches of fur. It was clear this dog had been abandoned for days. John crouched beside it, his calloused hands brushing the dog's filthy coat. He had seen suffering before, but something in this moment felt different. Something in the dog's silent plea struck deep inside him. For a second, he forgot his own misery. Compassion pushed aside self-preservation. He loosened his worn jacket, wrapping it around the dog's shivering body. The dog curled closer, as if understanding this was the only warmth it would find that day. John carried the dog through the empty streets to the nearest shelter. Inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and barking dogs. But the moment the worker at the front desk saw John and the stray, her expression shifted to something colder than the winter wind outside. She glanced at his worn clothes, at the dirt smudges on his face, and shook her head. "We can't accept him," she said firmly. "You're not qualified to adopt an animal." "There are procedures. We can't make exceptions." John froze, the words striking him harder than a blow. He looked down at the dog in his arms, eyes still closed against the cold, trusting him for warmth and safety. And now they were telling him he could not help it because of some paperwork rule? It felt absurd, cruel, unfair. Anger rose in him, slow and heavy, not just toward her or the shelter, but at a system that refused kindness, at a world that valued forms procedures, and qualifications more than compassion. At the silence of strangers walking past without stopping to help, he turned away without another word, the door closing behind him with a soft but final click. The cold air wrapped around him again, but inside John something burned hotter than frost, a deep, simmering anger, not just for himself, but for every living being left to suffer while the world looked the other way. That anger would not fade. It would become the spark that changed everything. John named the dog Buddy. It felt right somehow, simple, loyal, something steady in a life that had lost all stability. Buddy's whimpers and the weight of his suffering became something John couldn't ignore. He took him to an old veterinary clinic on the edge of the city, the kind of place where faded signs promised care for every creature, but where the air smelled of antiseptic and old wool. John barely had enough for the visit, but he scraped together every penny he could find, emptying pockets that held little more than lint and memories. The vet, a quiet woman named Dr. Evans, frowned as she examined Buddy. She didn't speak much, but her eyes said what her words did not. The dog was in bad shape. Malnourishment, an untreated infection, and exhaustion had worn him down far more than a stray should be. She gave John a list of medicine and instructions, but the cost of treatment was enough to make his stomach tighten. He gave her what he had and promised to return when he could. That night, John lay under his bridge with Buddy curled against him. He had no blanket thick enough to block the biting wind, no pillow but the rough pavement beneath him. Yet Buddy's breathing was a steady rhythm now, fragile but alive, and John found himself pressing closer. He wrapped his arms around the dog as if shielding him from the world, and for the first time in weeks he felt a kind of peace, fragile but real. Days passed in a blur of clinic visits and careful nursing, but Buddy's condition worsened. His breathing grew shallow, his eyes dimmed. Each cough tore at John's heart, and every step to the vet drained what little hope he had left. John slept less, eating even less, using his own dwindling energy to keep Buddy alive. He became a shadow of himself, driven only by the instinct to save the one creature who trusted him without question. One night, after a long day of walking the cold streets to collect loose change for medicine, John sat beside Buddy under the bridge. He brushed his fingers over the dog's matted coat, trying to soothe him, when his hand caught on something hard beneath the dirt of Buddy's collar. He leaned closer, brushing grime away. Beneath the worn leather was a small metal plate, engraved with a name and an address. The lettering was fine, polished, unlike anything a stray might wear. The words made him pause. The name read, Maxwell Harper. The address was in an upscale Cleveland neighborhood, a place of manicured lawns and wrought-iron gates. The kind of place John had only seen in magazines or on bus rides through the city. His mind raced. How had Buddy ended up here? Why was this dog wearing such a collar? The thought hit him harder than any winter wind. Buddy had not wandered into his life by accident. He had been taken, stolen, or lost, and no one had searched for him. Pain welled up in John, a quiet, aching pain, deeper than hunger or cold, not just for Buddy, but for what it said about the world, that a living creature could be lost without notice, that life could discard loyalty and suffering without thought, that kindness was often met with silence. But beneath that pain was another fear, sharper than any blade. If the truth came out, Buddy would be taken away. John's nights became restless with the thought. He imagined strangers knocking on his small encampment, telling him to let the dog go. The idea pierced him deeper than frostbite. Losing Buddy was not just losing a dog. It was losing the one reason he still believed he could matter. John stayed awake most of that night, Buddy resting in his arms, his fingers tracing the engraved plate. Outside, the city slept. Under the bridge, two broken lives clung to each other, both bound by pain and an unspoken understanding. Somewhere in the quiet, a silent question lingered. What would he have to give to protect Buddy? John Carter couldn't stop thinking about the collar. Every night, as frost bit his fingertips and Buddy lay sleeping beside him, his mind returned to those engraved words, Maxwell Harper, and that address. Somewhere in the back of his mind, buried under years of survival, there stirred a question he could no longer ignore. Who was Maxwell Harper, and how had Buddy ended up in his life? By morning, John made up his mind. He tucked Buddy's blanket tighter around him, slipped the dog gently into his arms, and began walking. The address on the collar was not far, in a part of the city John had never dared to visit. As he walked, his mind raced, imagining what awaited him. The neighborhood looked different with each step. Streets lined with tall oak trees, gates wrought with intricate designs, and houses that seemed pulled from another world, a world John had long since left behind. Finally, he stood before a sprawling mansion behind high stone walls, the kind of place where wealth seemed not just visible, but woven into every brick, every polished window pane. The gates gleamed in the morning light, guarded by silence and the air of something unreachable. John hesitated, Buddy resting quietly against his chest. But something deeper pushed him forward, a mixture of compassion for the dog and curiosity that had grown into determination. John knocked. The sound echoed softly, swallowed by the stillness. Moments later, the door opened, and an elderly woman appeared. Her hair was silver, her posture elegant, and her eyes widened as she looked at John and Buddy. "That collar," she said, voice trembling. Her gaze fell to Buddy. "Where did you find him?" John told her everything, the bridge, the night, the cold, the shelter's rejection, and the collar. Mrs. Harper listened quietly, her face a mask of disbelief. Then her lips parted, and she stepped aside, motioning him in. Inside, the house was filled with old photographs, portraits of a young man in military uniform. Mrs. Harper approached a cabinet, her hands trembling as she opened a small velvet-lined box. From it, she removed another collar, worn but elegant, and held it beside Buddy's. There was no doubt. "This belonged to Maxwell," she said softly. "My son. He went missing years ago, and so did Buddy." Her voice cracked. John could feel the weight of her grief. But then she did something unexpected. She reached for Buddy's collar. Behind the engraved plate was something John had not noticed before, a small, hidden compartment. Inside was a tiny object, a USB drive, strange and almost out of place. Mrs. Harper's eyes filled with tears as she examined it. "Maxwell, he was preparing for something. I never knew what. But this is part of his final wish." She carefully handed it to John. John's fingers shook as he took the drive. Mrs. Harper guided him to a quiet study. There, she inserted it into a computer. The screen lit up with documents, legal papers, photographs, and a will. John read the words in disbelief. Maxwell Harper's final will names Buddy as the heir to a multi-million-dollar trust. By law, Buddy's caretaker has the right to claim it. The air felt heavier, charged. John's heart pounded. Everything he had endured, the cold nights, the hunger, the silence, had led him here. The life he had known was poised to change forever. Hope bloomed in him like a sudden sunrise. For the first time in years, John allowed himself to imagine something different: shelter, stability, a future, not just for himself, but for Buddy, too. Yet hope came with its own shadow. He knew this discovery would bring challenges. The Harpers would not easily let go of what they believed was theirs, but deep inside, a quiet resolve began to form. Whatever it took, he would protect Buddy. That night, John sat with Buddy beneath the bridge again. The USB drive rested in his jacket pocket. Outside, the wind was sharp, but inside him there was warmth. The warmth of hope, fragile yet fierce. Tomorrow, he decided, he would begin the fight for their future. John Carter sat alone in the small corner of the shelter where he now spent most of his days. Buddy curled against his boots. The USB drive rested in his pocket like a secret flame, warm with possibility. He knew what it meant. The Harper family had a claim to that fortune, and they would fight him for it. The weight of the decision pressed on him. He could give Buddy back to them, walk away, let the past fade, and return to the shadow he had lived in for years. Or he could fight. Every hardship he had endured surged inside him: the nights beneath the bridge, the hunger, the cold, the indifference of a world that turned its back on him. Those years had taught him one thing: the quiet moments of compassion, no matter how small, deserved a voice. And Buddy had given him more than friendship. Buddy had given him purpose. John chose to fight. He scraped together the little money he had, borrowing wherever he could, and hired a lawyer who believed in his case. The battle that followed was exhausting. The Harper family brought powerful attorneys, prepared with arguments, legal precedents, and polished statements. They claimed John had no right to the fortune. They argued that Buddy was simply a lost pet, and the trust should revert to the family. John knew their words would be sharp, but he also knew he had something more: the truth. In the courtroom, John stood before the judge, Buddy at his feet. His voice was steady, but every word carried the weight of years lived in silence. He told Buddy's story: how he had found him under a bridge on a freezing morning, how the shelter had refused him, how every moment with Buddy had been a fight to keep him alive. He spoke of the engraved collar, the address, the hidden drive, the proof that Buddy was not a stray, but a living link to something far greater. "I'm not just fighting for a fortune," John said, looking toward the judge. "I'm fighting for every life that's been forgotten, for every soul that's been overlooked, and for Buddy, who trusted me when no one else would." The courtroom was silent. The judge listened intently, and then, after hours that felt like days, the gavel fell. John had won. The decision was clear. The fortune would be awarded to John Carter, the rightful caretaker of Buddy, in accordance with Maxwell Harper's final will. It was not just money. It was validation. It was justice. John did not keep the fortune for himself alone. The first thing he did was establish a shelter, a safe place for homeless veterans and abandoned animals. He called it Haven of Hope. It was more than a shelter. It was a symbol, proof that compassion could conquer indifference. The shelter filled quickly with veterans and their animals, a community bound together by shared hardship and healing. John worked tirelessly, not for recognition, but because he knew what it meant to be left behind. Buddy became the heart of Haven of Hope, a living reminder of loyalty and survival. Visitors would watch him curl up beside John in the corner, and many found in that scene a quiet inspiration. On opening day, John stood in front of the shelter with Buddy at his side. Veterans, volunteers, neighbors, Even strangers came to witness the moment. There was applause, there were tears, but what stayed with John most was the stillness in his own heart. For years, John had carried anger, pain, and doubt. Now those feelings had been replaced with something he thought he had lost forever: justice, and something even greater: hope. As the sun set over the shelter that evening, Buddy lay beside him, head resting against John's boot. John looked at the man he had become, not a soldier left forgotten, but a man who had found purpose again. He whispered softly to Buddy, "We made it, partner." And somewhere, in that quiet, a story that had begun with suffering ended in triumph.